I have noticed that among the major criticisms of certain books that I enjoy is that they are poorly paced or that they are slow paced. You know, you hear all the time, oh, Dance with Dragons is too slow, or Feast for Crows is too slow. Dance with Dragons happens to be my favorite book in A Song of Ice and Fire. Feast for Crows happens to be probably my second favorite book in A Song of Ice and Fire. And you hear it about Stormlight. I hear it a lot about The Wise Man's Fear, which is another book that I really love. And we're all reading big, giant fantasy books. So, of course, some of them are going to be slow-paced. It's not particularly surprising on the surface that these are criticisms that are brought up. However, some of them seem a bit odd to me. And that's not because I think that books can't be badly paced or that books can't be slowly paced. There are books that I have read that I think are slow. There are books that I've read that I think are badly paced, right? For example, when I read Gardens of the Moon a couple of years ago, I did think that it felt very slow. I have read 10 books of The Wheel of Time, and I do think that Crossroads of Twilight is a horribly paced book. As do most people, as far as I know. The question, however, is why is Crossroads of Twilight, for example, a horribly paced book? Well, for me, pacing is largely reliant on my enjoyment of other attributes of the book, such as the characters or the plot, and of course the style in which a book is written can greatly affect what we perceive as the pace of that book. So a lot of the time the pace is not so much its own thing as it is a conglomeration of other things. Now, that does not necessarily mean that for me pace always correlates perfectly with how much I enjoy a book. Right? There are books that I perceive as being fast-paced that I like varying amounts, and books I perceive as being slow-paced that I may like more than that. There are books, like Rage of Dragons is a very fast-paced book. I do enjoy it a lot, but there are books which are slower-paced than Rage of Dragons, which I like more. But I think you get the idea that what I'm trying to say is that, well, I don't generally look at a book and have a criticism and say, this book is horribly paced, and that's my critique of the book, and that's my sole critique of the book. The book may be badly paced, and I may have a problem with that, but generally, if I think a book is badly paced, that is because I have some problem with the characters, or with the plot, or just with the style of the prose, right? So if we're looking at Crossroads of Twilight, yeah, it's badly paced because the plot moves slowly. That's sort of the obvious answer. But it's kind of, I mean, I was not very impressed with the character work in Crossroads of Twilight, right? I just wasn't impressed with much. It's a 1,000-page book, and nothing happens. And if you have a 1,000-page book and nothing happens, then of course it is going to be badly paced, or at least a lot of people are going to perceive it as being badly paced. I do. There are people who disagree, and that's sometimes for good reasons, but I don't really think anything happens in that book, and that is the reason that it's badly paced. However, for some of the other books that I mentioned, if you look at, Stormlight or Feast or Dance or Kingkiller or even like The Lord of the Rings, I feel that there is a different thing going on here, and that's the part that I find odd. Now, to explain this, I'm going to try to look at some of the sorts of criticisms that I do find odd, and I'm going to attempt to explain to you why it is that I find these criticisms strange. The first thing I do feel I need to say, which I've kind of said already, but I'm still going to say it, is I'm not saying that somebody can't criticize a book because they think that the plot is uninteresting, that the events in the book are uninteresting, or there's a part of the book that is just boring to them. I don't have a problem with people doing that, really. I think it is completely natural, and I do it too. And that's because, of course, it is a criticism of the story itself. If you find a story boring, it's probably because of something with, the characters or the themes or what have you. Now, what I find odd is when the criticisms don't seem to be criticisms of the story itself, but rather just criticisms of the pacing. So let's look at The Wise Man's Fear, for example. With The Wise Man's Fear, a lot of people have that sort of criticisms where they're criticizing the presence of so many side plots. And some of those criticisms make complete sense. There are good reasons that people might criticize some of those side plots. I understand that a lot of people just don't like this long section in the middle with Felurian, right? There are a lot of side plots in The Wise Man's Fear. But often it seems to me that when people criticize certain side plots, for example, some of those in The Wise Man's Fear, they're not really criticizing the quality of the story, but rather they're criticizing simply the fact that these things are side plots. And that is what I feel is odd and sort of have an issue with, is these criticisms that are not directed at the quality of the story, but are rather directed at simply the fact that something appears to be a slight diversion or a more than slight diversion from the main plot of a book. And I do get it that side plots can be, too many side plots can be annoying. I get it. But a lot of the books I'm talking about are books that I like and books where I feel that these side plots are interesting stories in and of themselves or in the context of the book. They're books where I read these stories and I'm reading an interesting story about characters that I presumably like. Another book that I feel is a pretty good example of this sort of thing is Wind and Truth. Now, I certainly had problems with Wind and Truth, but I did really enjoy it overall. And one of the things my problems were not pacing problems. But a lot of people did have pacing problems with that book. And one of the things that people said a lot is there's so many POV swaps in this book. POV just jumps way too much. And in some ways that really did mirror some of the thoughts that I had while reading the book, which is I was kind of jokingly thinking he might as well just get rid of chapters at this point, because in Wind and Truth, you're switching POV pretty much 5 times a chapter, and it makes the chapter breaks very arbitrary. There's nothing really separating the chapter breaks from the breaks within chapters. So I thought Sanderson might as well just sort of do the Pratchett thing and get rid of chapters altogether, because you never get a chapter focused on only one character in that book. Aside from the Zeth flashbacks, and the Zeth flashbacks are all just extraordinarily short, right? At least relative to a good number of the flashbacks in the previous books, right? And so that is a thought that I had while reading it. So I understand this, but it's not really a pacing problem. It wasn't something that affected my enjoyment of the book. I get that it does affect some people's enjoyment of that book to have so many POV swaps, but it didn't negatively affect my enjoyment. And that leads us to the main reason I had for making this video, which is what is really the difference between these criticisms of the quality of story, what I'm saying are criticisms of the quality of the story, and the criticisms that I'm kind of portraying a bit negatively. And the difference is that most, or even all, it's probably not all, but most of the criticisms that I have of any book are fundamentally suspension of disbelief problems. And this is an interesting thing that I noticed a couple weeks ago. Basically, any criticisms that I have of basically any book, most of those criticisms are suspension of disbelief problems. If I'm criticizing the prose, and I'm saying, oh, this style of writing doesn't fit with the world, or I'm criticizing the writer's ability to set a scene or create atmosphere, I feel like it's fundamentally a suspension of disbelief thing. If I'm criticizing the dialogue in a book, then I'm saying this dialogue feels unrealistic, so it's hurting my suspension of disbelief. If I'm criticizing the characters in a book, generally that is because the characters feel too shallow or they feel unrealistic in some way. And the fact that they feel unrealistic or untrue to the human experience is hurting my suspension of disbelief. Most issues with plot that people have come down to, oh, there's a plot hole here, or this plot doesn't make sense, which is hurting our suspensions of disbeliefs. World building things are also obviously suspension of disbelief problems, right? But the point is that most things are fundamentally suspension of disbelief problems, and this just happens to be an interesting thing that I have noticed. I don't have much more to say right now in this video, and I don't have a way of ending these. So, see you.